Welcome to Sleepy Histories. Tonight, we'll wander through the mists of time to a faraway land, where banners once rippled in the wind and kings dreamed of crowns across the sea. Tonight, let the clashing of swords and the thunder of hooves fade into whispers. This is not a tale of conquest, but a gentle unraveling of centuries-old dreams. The 100 Years' War was a long and winding story, full of sieges and treaties, rival claims and restless kingdoms. But tonight, we tell it slowly, like a lullaby wrapped in parchment and time. As always, be sure to let us know in the comments what city you're listening from, and please let us know what topics you'd like us to cover in the future. Now close your eyes, breathe in, and let the wars of old lull you into peace. On a rain-soaked field near Crécy, in the dying light of August 26, 1346, the very soul of medieval warfare drew its last gasping breath. The thunder of hooves that had dominated battlefields for centuries fell silent beneath the whisper of English arrows, each shaft a harbinger of an age where nobility meant nothing against the mathematics of death. In that singular moment, as French knights lay crumpled in the mud like broken dolls, their golden fleur-de-lis banners trampled beneath English boots, the world shifted on its axis. The 100 Years' War had begun not merely as a dynastic squabble between cousins, but as the violent birth pains of the modern world itself. What commenced in 1337 as Edward III's ambitious claim to the French throne would evolve into something far more terrible and transformative. A conflict that would devour generations, reshape the very concept of nationhood, and leave Europe scarred by wounds that would fester for centuries. This was not simply war. It was metamorphosis through blood. A continental crucible where the medieval world would be burned away to reveal something unrecognizably modern in its ashes. The seeds of this catastrophic conflict were planted in the fertile soil of dynastic complexity that characterized medieval Europe. When Charles IV of France died in 1328 without male heirs, the French nobility faced a crisis that would echo through more than a century of warfare. The crown passed to Philip VI of Valois. But across the English Channel, young Edward III nursed a claim through his mother Isabella, daughter of Philip IV. The legal intricacies mattered less than the raw ambition they concealed. Edward's claim was less about legitimacy than about the tantalizing prospect of uniting the English and French crowns under one ruler. Yet to understand the true genesis of this conflict, one must look deeper than royal genealogies to the economic and social tensions that made war not merely possible, but inevitable. The relationship between England and France had grown increasingly fraught over trade, particularly the lucrative wool trade that connected English pastures to Flemish looms. England's economic lifeline ran through French-controlled territories, creating a dependency that chafed against English pride and ambition. When Philip VI began asserting greater control over English holdings in Gascony, confiscating lands and challenging English authority, he was not merely exercising royal prerogative. He was striking at the economic foundation of English power. The outbreak of hostilities revealed immediately that this would be unlike any previous medieval conflict. At Sluys in 1340, English naval supremacy was established in a battle so brutal that chroniclers claimed the fish grew fat on French blood. The English fleet, commanded by Edward himself, caught the French navy at anchor and proceeded to methodically destroy it in what amounted to a maritime slaughter. Ships became floating funeral pyres, the English archers raining death from above, while men-at-arms finished the work in vicious hand-to-hand combat. The victory gave England control of the English Channel, but more importantly, it demonstrated a new ruthlessness that would characterize the entire conflict. Barbara Tuchman, in her magisterial examination of the 14th century, observed that war is the unfolding of miscalculations. Never was this more evident than in the French nobility's catastrophic underestimation of English military innovation. The longbow, in English hands, became not merely a weapon, but an instrument of social revolution. At Crécy, Where this narrative began, the flower of French chivalry charged headlong into what amounted to an industrial killing machine. The English had positioned their archers on rising ground, creating overlapping fields of fire that turned the battlefield into a death trap. The battle itself unfolded with the terrible logic of a Greek tragedy. Wave after wave of French knights, their armor gleaming in the fading sunlight, charged up the slope toward the English positions. The longbowmen, mostly drawn from the yeomanry of England and Wales, sent clouds of arrows that darkened the sky before falling like deadly rain. Each arrow could penetrate the finest mail, and the English archers could loose 12 aimed shots per minute. The mathematics of death were simple and inexorable. What made Crécy particularly horrifying was not just the scale of the slaughter, though French casualties numbered in the thousands while English losses were minimal, but the complete inversion of the social order it represented. Common-born archers had brought down the greatest names in French nobility. The Count of Alençon, the Count of Flanders, King John of Bohemia, all lay dead, their noble blood mixing indiscriminately with that of their retainers in the churned mud of the battlefield. The implications went beyond military tactics to challenge the very foundations of medieval society. Jonathan Sumption, whose exhaustive multi-volume study of the conflict represents the definitive modern account, has noted that the war fundamentally altered not just how battles were fought, but how societies understood themselves. The English victories at Crécy, and later at Poitiers in 1356, were not merely tactical triumphs, but symbolic earthquakes that shattered assumptions about valor, nobility, and the divine order. When King John II of France was captured at Poitiers and led away in chains, it marked not just a military defeat, but a crisis of legitimacy that would haunt French monarchy for generations. The capture of the French king created a surreal interlude in the conflict, one that revealed both the chivalric ideals that still governed medieval warfare and their increasing irrelevance in the face of political realities. John was treated with exquisite courtesy by his captors, housed in luxury and allowed to maintain a court in exile. Yet his ransom, 3 million gold crowns, an astronomical sum, effectively bankrupted France and forced the kingdom to confront the gap between its military pretensions and its economic reality. The war's middle period, roughly from 1360 to 1415, saw a fundamental shift in character. What had begun as a dynastic dispute evolved into something approaching total war, with both sides employing increasingly desperate measures. The English, unable to maintain large armies in the field indefinitely, turned to a strategy of chevauchée, systematic devastation of the French countryside, designed to destroy the economic basis of French resistance. These were not military campaigns in any traditional sense, but exercises in state-sponsored terrorism, with English forces burning crops, destroying vineyards, and slaughtering livestock across vast swaths of France. The psychological impact of these campaigns was devastating. French peasants, already burdened by crushing taxation imposed to fund the war effort, found their livelihoods systematically destroyed by an enemy they could rarely even glimpse, let alone fight. The resulting social upheaval manifested in revolts like the Jacquerie of 1358, where desperate peasants turned their rage not just against their English tormentors, but against their own nobility, whom they blamed for their misery. It was during this period that the conflict began to assume its truly modern character. The traditional feudal bonds that had held medieval society together were dissolving under the pressures of sustained warfare. Armies increasingly consisted not of feudal levies bound by personal loyalty, but of professional soldiers fighting for pay. The English archer, once a yeoman fulfilling his feudal obligations, became a mercenary, selling his skills to the highest bidder. French response took the form of organized companies of routiers, professional soldiers who often continued their depredations even during periods of nominal peace. The transformation was perhaps most evident in the evolution of military technology and tactics. The English longbow, devastating as it was, represented merely the beginning of a revolution that would render traditional knightly warfare obsolete. Gunpowder weapons, primitive but psychologically terrifying, began to appear on battlefields. The psychological impact of early cannons often exceeded their tactical effectiveness. The thunderous roar and clouds of sulphurous smoke seemed to announce the arrival of hell itself on Earth. The war's impact extended far beyond the battlefield to reshape the very concept of royal authority. Both English and French monarchs found themselves forced to make unprecedented bargains with their subjects to fund their military ambitions. The English Parliament gained significant power by leveraging its control over taxation, while French kings were forced to convene the Estates General and negotiate with merchant guilds and municipal governments. The absolute monarchy that would characterize early modern Europe was forged in the fiscal crucible of the 100 Years' War. The resumption of active warfare under Henry V marked the conflict's final and perhaps most devastating phase. Henry's victory at Agincourt in 1415 surpassed even Crécy in its demonstration of English military superiority and its psychological impact on French morale. The battle itself was a masterpiece of tactical planning and brutal execution. The French, despite having learned nothing from previous disasters, once again charged a prepared English position, only to find themselves trapped in a muddy field where their numerical superiority became a liability. The aftermath of Agincourt revealed the war's complete departure from chivalric norms. Henry V, the hero king celebrated in Shakespeare's plays, ordered the systematic execution of French prisoners when he feared a counterattack. The decision was coldly pragmatic. Wounded prisoners were a liability, and Henry lacked the men to guard them. But it marked the complete subordination of chivalric honor to military necessity. The flower of French nobility, those who had not died in the initial charge, were butchered like cattle in the mud of the battlefield. Henry's subsequent conquest of Normandy proceeded with methodical brutality that shocked even contemporaries. The siege of Rouen in 1418 to 1419 lasted 6 months, during which the civilian population was systematically starved into submission. Chronicles describe scenes of almost unimaginable horror. Mothers throwing their children from the city walls to end their suffering. Desperate citizens boiling leather and eating rats, corpses piling up in the streets. When the city finally surrendered, Henry's terms were characteristically harsh. Heavy indemnities, hostages, and the installation of English garrisons throughout Normandy. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 represented the apparent culmination of English ambitions. Henry IV was recognized as heir to the French throne, and his marriage to Catherine of Valois seemed to promise the dynastic union that Edward III had dreamed of nearly a century earlier. Yet the treaty also marked the beginning of the war's final transformation from a conflict between kingdoms to a struggle for national identity. The Dauphin Charles, disinherited by his own father, established a rival court south of the Loire and continued resistance from what amounted to a rump French state. Henry V's death in 1422, followed shortly by Charles VI's demise, created the bizarre situation of an infant, Henry VI, being proclaimed king of both England and France. The impossibility of this arrangement became immediately apparent. English resources, stretched to their limits by decades of warfare, could not sustain the occupation of half of France indefinitely. French resistance, meanwhile, began to assume a genuinely popular character that previous phases of the conflict had lacked. The emergence of Joan of Arc in 1429 marked the war's most dramatic turning point, though not for the reasons often imagined. Joan herself was less important as a military leader than as a symbol of French national consciousness finally awakening after nearly a century of humiliation. Her claim of divine mission resonated with a population desperate for hope, but her real significance lay in what she represented: the transformation of the conflict from a dynastic dispute into a war of national liberation. Joan's military career was brief but transformative. The relief of Orléans, her most significant tactical achievement, was less important for its immediate military consequences than for its psychological impact. For the first time since the war's beginning, French forces had won a significant victory against the English, and they had done so under the banner of a peasant girl who claimed to speak for God and France. The implications for French morale were immense, but equally important was the demonstration that English military supremacy was not divinely ordained or tactically insurmountable. The trial and execution of Joan of Arc in 1431 provided the French cause with something it had previously lacked: a martyr whose death could be laid squarely at English feet. The English had hoped that discrediting Joan would demoralize French resistance, but the opposite occurred. Her death transformed her from a military leader into a symbol of French suffering under English occupation, and her memory became a rallying point for continued resistance. The war's final phase, from 1435 to 1453, witnessed the systematic collapse of English power in France. The reconciliation between the Dauphin Charles and Philip the Good of Burgundy, through the Treaty of Arras, deprived England of its most important continental ally and marked the beginning of the end for English ambitions in France. Without Burgundian support, English forces found themselves increasingly isolated in a hostile countryside, where every village might harbor enemies and every forest could conceal an ambush. The economic exhaustion that had been building throughout the conflict finally reached its breaking point. England, with a population roughly 1/4 that of France, had maintained its continental empire through a combination of military superiority and French disunity. As French resistance became more organized and English military advantages were eroded by changes in technology and tactics, the fundamental imbalance in resources began to tell. The final English defeat came not through a single climactic battle, but through a series of campaigns that systematically reduced English holdings to the single port of Calais. The Battle of Castillon in 1453, where the English commander John Talbot was killed in a desperate assault on entrenched French positions defended by artillery, marked the symbolic end of English dreams of continental empire. Talbot, the most feared English commander of his generation, died as so many French nobles had died a century earlier, charging uselessly against an enemy whose technological advantages had rendered his tactics obsolete. The war's conclusion left both kingdoms fundamentally transformed. France emerged from the conflict with a stronger monarchy, a more centralized administration, and, perhaps most importantly, a sense of national identity forged in the crucible of foreign occupation and resistance. The French king, who had been unable to defend his realm in 1337, had been replaced by a monarch who commanded professional armies and could raise unprecedented sums through taxation. The France that expelled the English was not the same kingdom that had been invaded. It was recognizably the foundation of the early modern French state. England's transformation was equally profound, but more traumatic. The loss of continental territories forced English elites to focus their ambitions on their island kingdom, contributing to internal conflicts that would soon manifest in the Wars of the Roses. The parliamentary institutions that had gained power by funding the war effort retained their enhanced authority, laying foundations for England's eventual evolution toward constitutional monarchy. Yet the immediate aftermath of defeat was social and political upheaval, as returning soldiers and displaced administrators struggled to find their place in a kingdom that had been militarized for more than a century. The human cost of the conflict defies easy calculation. Battlefield casualties, horrific as they were, represented only a fraction of the war's toll. The systematic devastation of the French countryside, the displacement of populations, the breakdown of trade and agriculture, and the spread of disease in the wake of armies created suffering on a scale that medieval chroniclers struggled to comprehend. The demographic impact was catastrophic. Some regions of France lost half their population during the war's course, creating wastelands that took generations to recover. Perhaps more significant than the immediate suffering was the war's role in accelerating social and economic changes that were already transforming medieval Europe. The conflict's enormous financial demands broke down traditional feudal relationships and accelerated the transition to monetary economies. Peasants who might have remained bound to the soil for generations found themselves forced into military service or urban labor. Women, left to manage estates and businesses while men were at war, assumed economic roles that medieval society had previously denied them. The war's technological legacy was equally transformative. The English longbow, which had dominated the conflict's early phases, was itself rendered obsolete by improvements in armor and the development of firearms. The professional armies that emerged from the conflict, trained in the use of gunpowder weapons and organized according to new tactical principles, bore little resemblance to the feudal levies that had begun the war. Military engineering, siege warfare, and logistics had all evolved dramatically under the pressure of sustained conflict. Yet perhaps the war's most enduring legacy lay in its contribution to the development of national consciousness. The conflict had begun as a dispute between feudal overlords with competing claims to territories and titles. It ended as a struggle between peoples who had begun to see themselves as fundamentally different from their enemies. The English who evacuated France in the 1450s were not simply the subjects of a defeated king. They were foreigners being expelled from a land that had come to see them as alien invaders. The cultural impact extended far beyond politics and military affairs. The war years saw the emergence of vernacular literatures that celebrated national heroes and demonized foreign enemies. English chroniclers portrayed their own kings as champions of justice against French treachery, while French writers increasingly depicted the conflict as a struggle between a godly people and foreign demons. These narrative frameworks, crude as they often were, provided the foundation for national mythologies that would influence European politics for centuries. Tuchman observed that, in the midst of war and crisis, nothing is as clear or as certain as it appears in hindsight. And nowhere is this more evident than in assessing the 100 Years' War's ultimate significance. To contemporaries, the conflict often seemed a meaningless succession of campaigns that brought nothing but suffering to ordinary people while enriching soldiers and tax collectors. The grand strategies and national destinies that historians now discern were invisible to those who lived through the daily reality of war. Yet viewed from the perspective of centuries, the conflict's transformative impact becomes undeniable. The medieval world of 1337, dominated by feudal relationships and dynastic loyalties, had given way by 1453 to something recognizably modern in its emphasis on centralized authority, professional administration, and national identity. The war had not created these changes. They were already emerging from deeper social and economic transformations, but it had accelerated and channeled them in ways that would shape European development for centuries. The 100 Years' War stands as perhaps the most significant conflict of the medieval period, precisely because it was not entirely medieval. It began with knights charging across flower-strewn fields in pursuit of dynastic glory, but it ended with artillery barrages reducing castle walls to rubble, while professional soldiers fought for monthly wages rather than feudal honor. It began as a quarrel between cousins over inheritance rights, but it ended as a war between nations that had discovered their fundamental incompatibility. In the smoking ruins of Castillon, where English dreams of continental empire finally died, the medieval world drew its last breath. What emerged from the ashes was not simply the end of one war, but the beginning of the modern age. An age where questions of identity and nationality would matter more than bloodlines and feudal obligations, where technological innovation would matter more than individual valor, and where the power to tax and conscript entire populations would matter more than the ability to inspire personal loyalty among a handful of knights. The Crimson Century had ended, but its legacy would endure. In the centralized monarchies of early modern Europe, in the professional armies that would dominate European battlefields for the next 3 centuries, in the very concept of the nation-state that would come to define political organization, the shadows of the 100 Years' War stretched far into the future. What had begun as the last great medieval conflict had become, almost without anyone realizing it, the first great modern war. The fields of Crécy and Agincourt had been ploughed under by subsequent generations, but the transformation they witnessed, the violent birth of the modern world from the corpse of medieval Christendom, would echo through centuries of European history. In that transformation, brutal and traumatic as it was, lay the foundations of the world we still inhabit today.